And maybe at another time I'll tell you about that Racing Art History book. Actually was very much based on articles that I collected when I was a graduate student here. So it has a very direct Yale connection, and it's been a thrill that it's brought me kind of full circle back here into the fold of Yale. So I'm just going to speak a little bit. This book came out in 2016, and it wasn't until a couple of nights ago that I realized that that was a long time ago, and I had to read my own book. So bear with me in terms of, I marked all these little places here that relate to the slides. So this book was something that, let me actually set a timer because I can be quite unfettered and discursive, which was one of the first descriptions of me when I first started teaching. She had a very discursive teaching style. I think that means that I go all over the place. So let me make sure I keep this to where it's supposed to be. All right. So this book was something that came out of a lot of different things that I had been doing. Again, a paper that started as a graduate student here at Yale. I wrote on images of the Black Christ that were very specifically images in the fine art realm. And then that became part of a job talk that I gave. And when I gave that job talk in Chicago and actually got that job at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, my first week on the job, a stained glass historian and person who is a preservationist as well had been sitting in the audience of my job talk, and he found me in my office and said, there are a lot of churches in Chicago that have Black Christ. I go as a consultant for their stained glass, and I see these murals and these other images, and that is how this book began. And it was a journey that maybe we can talk about later in the discussion part of it, where I learned quite a bit about how you don't just knock on church doors and say, hey, I want to see your art. That it really is about taking time, a lot of time. So much time, so many years that my children all were born while I was doing this book, and they remember the van, me riding around in our family van with one or two of them in their car seats going around and visiting my churches, as they called them. And it really was, as all of you know, it's really about meeting with the church ladies and getting to know many people who have access to the buildings. It's not so much about the pastor, for instance. It really has a lot to do with, I became really close with some of the maintenance men who took care of the grounds and everything, and they helped me take the pictures and all of those things. But anyway, let me start here. So I'm just going to talk, I'm focusing after this wonderful conversation I had with Braxton about the visual, how the visual can create a space, and also how there's sonic space, right, in the churches. So my book, if you get a chance to look at it, covers murals all over Chicago, and not necessarily in churches, but just for my 15 minutes today, I'm just going to focus on a few of the murals and imagery that was inside actual churches. And unfortunately, some of these are really bad images that I took in the 1990s when I started working on this. The image that you see here is Pilgrim Baptist Church, and unfortunately, what you're seeing here burned down in 2004, I believe, 2004 or 2007, I can't remember. So one of the things that came out of my delving into these churches is that I had some of the only images of these interior murals from the 1930s. So that's giving you a little bit of the interior space at Pilgrim Baptist. And these are a few close-ups I'm just going to show you. So these were Pilgrim Baptist itself, and I hope we can talk more about this because I am not a musicologist, but what was interesting to me was that Thomas A. Dorsey was located in this church, and at the same time that he was bringing his own very special branch of gospel music to Chicago. The William Edward Scott, the painter, was also painting at the same time. I had the amazing honor to actually interview some very elderly but surviving congregants who were children during this time, and that they had the experience on Sundays of actually watching these paintings be painted while they were listening to Thomas A. Dorsey. And so this was all because of the brainchild of how important all of these arts were to creating a safe and empowering space for the Black people that came to this church, and that was because of Junius Austin. And he hired both of them at the same time to create this. And that first image I showed you with the throngs of crowds, that was taken in the early days of the church, around the time, a little bit before these were actually made. And so I'm just showing you some details so I can just go on, but I'm going to read to you one of the great things about this image is that the actual presence, the body of the pastor, was taken into account. And what you see here, and I'm going to read to you a little bit out of my book because I don't remember everything I wrote here. Oh, you know what? Sorry. Glasses. Also making me feel old. I can't even read my own writing without some help. So, I don't know if any of you can guess what you're seeing here, right? You know what the scene is, right? Yeah, Mary's at the tomb. And can you guess what that archway leads to? It's the tomb, but it's the sanctuary. So this is where the pastor would emerge. Every time. How about that? Yes. So I'm just going to read to you a little bit. The most striking incorporation of the resurrection metaphor into the mural could be seen in the entrance to Christ's tomb, painted around the door of the sanctuary, through which Reverend Austin emerged fully reborn before each service. Small spotlights on the floor extended the painted rays of yellow and white onto the actual body of the pastor as he entered. Austin transformed into a Black Christ, came to life as a painted angel to his right greeted him with the benediction represented by two raised fingers. On his left, the three Marys would have appeared startled by the pastor's sudden presence. Once he had taken his position at the pulpit, they would then silently gape at the empty tomb. Dorsey's choir would, of course, have added this dramatic effect. Austin's interaction with the mural activated specific biblical passages regarding the empty tomb, the resurrected Christ, and his own racially politicized presence. Here, Austin's identification with the resurrected Christ reinforced the congregants' identification with the different Christ in the surrounding scenes. And I don't have too many details of that, but one of the most interesting things about this church is that there are about 4 different images of Christ, and they are different colors. Which is something, again, after sitting with this material for a while, I realized at first I was like, oh, there's a white Christ, and then there's kind of like, let's say, a Semitic Christ and a Black Christ. And then I thought, oh no, as we all know, they could all be Black Christs, because sitting in that congregation as sitting in this room, Black people are many different colors. And so for me, sitting with those images, I thought, oh my God, this really is speaking to all the people in the room, because these Christs are so many different colors. So I was going to read from some of Austin's sermons because he often emphasized the resurrection, but maybe I'll just move along. Well, I'll just say here. Here's one of his sermons that was published. This new birth has at its purpose the obliterating of racial barriers and antipathies and even national prejudices. and the making of men brothers in Christ Jesus. By this new birth, our triumph over death, by this new birth, race relationship becomes human. We belong to the human race. Our law becomes the law of love, and our object in living is immediately the welfare of the other fellow. So these are, just imagine, I mean, it's so hard in pages to kind of put together a sermon while I'm showing you slides, but these things would have been happening together in this space, which I think is just fascinating. Okay, so that's just a little snippet of that chapter. This other church, First Church of Deliverance in Chicago, also had an incredibly charismatic leader, and that was Clarence Henry Cobb, who was not only an important religious figure, but also an important socialite in the city of Chicago. And one of the things that he was kind of crossing over was to bring into his church many of the people that were considered to be the underbelly of Chicago. So he actually would have services at 11:30 at night. And it was often very well known that you would see people leaving the clubs down there on the south side to go to church, to go to his church. Other things that he did, he created an entire complex around this church in the 1930s, even until his death in 1979, that had one of the first churches to have like formal housing for unwed mothers. One of the first churches in Chicago to also help prostitutes leave what they were doing and actually have some livelihood. So he served a lot of sort of welfare services that were not necessarily available to African Americans at that time. So he actually took over an old hat shop that was in the neighborhood. So then there was this extra way in which the congregants, also some of them used to work in it. So they had this other relationship of being in the building. He hired Frederick Jones, who at that time, I think had just graduated as a student from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And he was asked to do a number of murals, and also he did the carvings on the doors. So before you even entered the church, you had these portraits of congregants who are in the orans position. I should mention this was a spiritualist church. So that's an important gesture that is part of the spiritualist church, as you may know. This is a detail that you see here of one of the number of murals that were inside this church. And he liked to have portraits, the artists, of actual people who went to the church. And one of the things about, as I mentioned with Cobb's, is that he was always speaking to the common man. And so he would often have radio broadcasts. That's the other important thing about him. He was one of the first African-American pastors to do radio. And when you go to this church, which is amazing inside even today, he set up everything as, on air, off air. The lights have overhead lights, so it was very well lit as well. And then there are mics all around the church. So again, something that's very common today, was very, very revolutionary in the 40s. Okay. Oops. Oh, sorry. I'm getting this. Okay. Oh my gosh. Sorry, the VPN is making me do something. It won't let me move. Come on. How about now? So when you get into, this is part of the interior of the church. And one of the things I wanted to show you is you see that the whole layout, and I'm showing you details. Oops. See, it's time for me to stop. I will go through this quickly. So the painter himself was very interested in recreating in the painting what you see in the actual ceremony, what the congregants were participating in. And I have something here about that. The painted pastor alongside Jesus reinforced the impact and sanctity of the live performing pastor at each service. And I have a little detail here. There we go. Oh my gosh, I don't forward here. So that is, so you would see behind him as he is performing the painting of him. Unlike the scenes at Pilgrim, which I just showed you, that was the one with the tomb, these at FCOD were not biblical scenes, but events that included the viewer in real time. These visual devices help the congregation and Cobbs to be in the presence of Christ. So on the other side of this is actually an image of Christ welcoming the congregants, his suffering and his grace. Jones also emphasizes this aspect of realism in the foyer, as I just showed you, with images of the taxi drivers and other people. For instance, there were a number of women in red, which was identified with prostitution. Okay, so I'm almost done. So moving right along, so that was the 40s, 1940s. I had the pleasure of having in my history of mural class a student named Lamar, and he was a very devout student at the art school. And he had started working right after he finished being a student, doing murals on churches and also community centers. And this is one of his most elaborate works, and also on the cover of the book is also his work. So, for instance, this is his, oh my gosh, this is his also. And this is a mosaic that is actually on the exterior of a church. But just to give you a sense of, he worked very closely with a very popular church on the south side, on the southwest side, called the House, which was a hip-hop church, essentially. And this particular community center is part of the House. And I'm just going to read to you briefly. What you can't really read was the text that he put there. So you see that he is using contemporary figures to actually illustrate this passage. And this is what is actually on the text. And yo, I'm doing a new thing. Can you feel me? I'm making a new way out of the dark of the wilderness of life. I'm bringing out rivers from the desert. And those of you may recognize that. It is a translation, that's right, Isaiah. I heard it. Isaiah 43:19. And the King James Version is, behold, I will do a new thing. Now it shall spring forth. Shall ye not know it? I will even make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. So, one of the wonderful things about Damon, who I recently just saw again, is that he, we could talk more about this, is that he also did a whole t-shirt line of his drawings, his paintings. He still makes these, really popular in terms of churches bringing him in, also his whole line of devout imagery that often has this incredible, walking the line with contemporary life. And I'm going to have 2 more images and I'll be over. So another thing that is in my book, actually part of that more contemporary chapter, but now contemporary in terms of when I wrote it many years ago, was a whole section in my book about devout graffiti. And I was very fortunate that I ride a bike, and I was riding around one summer in Chicago and came upon this at an intersection that I had gone through many times, many years, that had different types of graffiti there all the time. And I was very fortunate. I was teaching a summer class and had to go downtown every day that I caught this because it was only up there for 2 weeks. And it was anonymous to me then, and ironically, or maybe just the way the world works, when I showed this photograph in an exhibition 6 years later in Albuquerque, New Mexico, there was someone there who said, I know this artist. His name is B Saves, and he does this work in California, actually. And he said, I don't know why he was in Chicago, but it did say B Saves at the bottom. And then I was able to connect with that artist. So that's a little thing there. And the last image is just, again, to talk about artists creating spaces. Theaster Gates is a contemporary artist. He is not necessarily very religious, although he has started a group that performs with him called the Black Monks of Mississippi. And he does often religious imagery in his work, among other things. And this was him creating a sacred space actually in a museum. And he often uses recycled materials. And one of the things is that a church that was being torn down on the south side of Chicago, he was able to get access to it. And he has been making art out of the materials from that church for the last almost 10 years. And he even did performances in it. I could have shown you video of him with the Black Monks of Mississippi singing in this church as it's completely like falling down inside. But he has been taking parts of that church all around the world and making installations. And that's a whole nother thing that we could possibly talk about, is that what does that mean, you know, when you take a church apart as an artist? But he feels that he is recreating sacred spaces when he does that. And that is the end. Thank you. Should I turn all this off? Sure. All right. In the middle? How about I sit? I sit in the middle. Okay. In the hot seat. I feel like I'm in the hot seat. Okay.
Well, that was extremely provocative, and I have a lot of notes I jotted down. So maybe I'll just throw some of them out, and then we'll see where we go.
All right.
Okay?
Okay.
I'm struck by what I take to not be a coincidence. The fact that so many of the murals were right up against the choir stand. Mm-hmm. The framing of space sonically and visually often seem to be coincident. And then you talked about Dorsey and the painting happening at the same time. I think what I'm especially interested in is the way that these churches were spaces of innovation at this moment, right? You're a couple decades into the Great Migration.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Life in Chicago is changing. You know, the black population in Chicago goes up like 500% in 20 or 30 years, and that creates social and political and liturgical upheaval that makes this artwork have an important, I think, historical grounding. Pilgrim is a place Dorsey's hanging out. It's a great black church drama. Dorsey was hired first at Ebenezer to start a gospel choir, and he got poached by Junior C. Austin, you know, the pastor of Ebenezer. J.H.L. Smith wanted to gloat, and so he went to preach Junior Austin's pastor's anniversary, and the week after his gospel choir debuted, he took the gospel choir with him, and Austin was like, I think I want this, and he took the choir. He took Dorsey from Smith. Anyway, this is the place where the gospel blues, right, is happening. And so instead of white Christ being painted, you have black Christ being painted. Mm-hmm. And instead of liturgical music indistinguishable from what the white Protestants down the street were singing, you have, right, black sound being returned to. It's a renaissance of black vernacular sort of sacred expression. You've got the politics of respectability that it reigned and was necessary coming up against the new cultural forces of that moment. Then the second thing, to think about First Church of Deliverance. You talk about the innovations in terms of social programs, but also, you know, this is the church where the Hammond organ makes its way into Black gospel, and from there into American popular music and globally, because Kenneth Morris plays the organ in this church on these early broadcasts, and so the sound literally travels across the city. And other churches want to get in on it, in part because the Hammond organ is produced, manufactured, invented in Evanston, so just up the road from Chicago. So I think that, for me, innovation and art, but not, you make a distinction in your book between, when you say public art, you're saying something that's like getting us away from high and low. And I think that this is a something happening musically, right? That it's not Beethoven and Bach only, right? But Dorsey's blues becoming, right, art that's codified. So innovation and art working together in the space, those are the things that jump out to me. And I guess I'd ask if you saw, with the other churches you looked at in this period of time, other places where the location of choir, of instrument, and art converged in an important way.
All of them, yes. I would say, I'm just going to take a minute to just turn this on so you can just see more of the image. I kind of like using the slideshow, and then you just keep seeing the stuff. Let's see if we can do that. So you don't have to change it so much. Okay. Let's see. But let's see if I can make it just run. How about that? Maybe I can. Yeah. It's just gonna go. There we go. I think we'll just go. Maybe not. Oh. Well, sorry. I'll just put this here. So you can see that. And maybe that's a good example, right?
Yeah.
What you're talking about?
Right.
Yes, and they are always, there's always imagery that is, when they have it, that is located there. And then that usually, when I would read about the commissions, that those were the first thing commissioned, and then the other thing, it kind of grew, so then there may be stuff in the lobby or even in the sanctuary. And the funny thing about this is that when I first started this odyssey, as I told you in the very beginning, that stained glass person, expert, he gave me the name of a place called, I think it was called Sacred Partnerships or something like that, and that was a conservation company for all denominations, all religions, to help them with their actual facilities. And that person gave me a whole list of these churches that had murals in them. And I would call up, and this happened at least twice, and they're like, we don't know what you're talking about. There's nothing like that here. And then I would go back to my original source, and they're like, I was there. I saw them. They're right behind the pastor, the whole time. They're really centrally located. And then I would call back. This happened twice. And the person at the desk said, oh my God, young lady, I'm so glad you called back. Of course they're here. We just don't notice them because they're so much just a part of the background. I also learned with that kind of thing that, as I mentioned, these were older. And each pastor, of course, has his or her legacy. And those were old. So they weren't necessarily pointed out or used the way, so Pilgrim Baptist in 2010, that pastor was not necessarily making references to those images the way that Junius Austin would have, right? Because those were his images, that he commissioned those. So that's another little lesson that I learned about these older works of art and how they were recognized or not 30, 40, 50 years later. But the innovation part, I think, is really important. That's why, I could have just spoken about Pilgrim Baptist because, Austin was so clever in terms of what he was building there, and the fact that he understood that it had to be the music and the images, that they had to work together. My book only focuses actually on a number of churches that have that innovation, what you pointed out, that really understood the power of images and often the power of music. Because of course there are many, many more churches, black churches in Chicago, but I focused on those where the heads of those institutions really understood and had a clear vision on what visual art could do in their churches as well as for their congregants. And the music often went with that. So Saint Sabina I have a whole chapter on Black Catholic churches, and Saint Sabina, I'm sure you all know about Saint Sabina because of how famous the pastor is there. Complete plan, like art is commissioned very specifically for certain areas. Certain artists were brought on, and then they trained other artists. And of course, the gospel choirs there are, also, and they also have a dance program. So the arts is so central there as a way to engage everyone.
I think this is one of the most important parts of your project, the taken for granted nature, right? The way that the images had ceased to be news or recognizable,
Yes.
right? Because they had become the space. And I think this is where, in a way, we sort of are interested in similar things, which is to say that just because you build a building and you put chairs or pews in it, right? The difference between space and place often hinges on how you feel it, right? And whether you're feeling it sonically or visually, the content of what enters it, and also I think the proximity folks have to the moment of creation, right? It's just why the stories that people could recall about watching it, right? They're intimately connected to it, but the space, right, becomes place as art enters. I guess I wonder if you would talk a bit about the work you've done outside the religious context, and how your scholarship with the first book, the more general work you've done on race and art, is both particularized by, complicated by what you encountered in these black churches in Chicago.
That is a great question. So, and this is where I tell my little speaking out of school, I guess, story about my first book, Racing Art History. So that book, and maybe some of you have heard me say this on campus ever since I came back a year and a few months ago, it came directly out of what I did not get in my Ph.D. program. So it was a little thing to just keep me a little sane. And so I'd be in a class about architecture, and I'm like, I'm pretty sure there was some black architects. I'm gonna look that up. And then I had a little manila folder, and I'd get that article, slide it in there, and I'd be in a medieval art class, and be like, I'm pretty sure there are some black saints too. And then I'd go look that up, and I would put that in the manila folder. And so that book was the manila folder that I created here as a graduate student at Yale, based on my own pursuit of getting things that were not canonized and that I was not being taught. And so, and then I could go on to how that manila folder became a book, but it was, again, I met with an editor from Rutledge about something else. I was actually going to write a book on Oprah. This was the 90s. Late 90s. And then he literally said to me, what if Bell Hooks wrote something about art history? Well, she had written art on my mind. And I would also say that Bell Hooks, I had every one of her books that I acquired here when I was a graduate student, and then also her teaching, like Teaching to Transgress, which we just used as a all-convocation book at the School of Art when I started teaching. So she was really influential to me when I was a graduate student. And that's when I pulled out this manila folder, which I had made into a very illegal Xerox packet for the first graduate seminar that I taught called Racing Art History. And I told him, look, you're an editor, I have no rights to any of this stuff. The students just hand me cash, please. I get it done at Kinko's. And then he said, oh, this is what I was talking about. And that's how the book became a book. So it went from my sanity folder when I was a graduate student. So that's a long way to talk about how that transition to me looking at Black churches again. I think you get that a lot of serendipity kind of guides what I do. And that I had pursued in that one class on American art, I had decided to write on images of Black Christ. And I think that was definitely part of, it was here, me trying to bring another type of work into the classroom, to my classmates and to my professors. And I was very interested in that. That came directly from me starting off as a medievalist. So it was a way for me to take all of the sort of biblical knowledge that I had to have on studying medieval art, knowing the Bible, knowing passages, knowing imagery. And then it was kind of a natural and seamless transition in American art for me to look at religious themes. Yeah, so that's.
I wonder if it might be time to transition to the audience, just to take some questions for Q&A.
Well,
And I
before
also
the
know.
Audience, I have a question for you.
Oh, okay.
I know you've done some great work on Black church arson, remediation, and the museum.
Yeah.
And I wonder if, having heard this discussion about space, you might think about the destruction and remediation of space, how this conversation relates to the work you have done and are continuing to do.
Yeah, I mean, I've used, full disclosure, I used your work to write a piece about Black church arson and a piece of art made from allegedly a burned Black church by Cornelia Parker. And, in reading your work for that article and returning to it, again for today, I thought a lot about, one, conversations around materiality, art versus sort of thingness, right? And matter, which is kind of on our minds right now. But I also was very interested in what you said at the beginning, right? And thinking about process, right? The process by which you did this work. And what it meant to knock on a door versus develop relationships with church ladies. Or the difference between the depictions of Christ versus the depictions of the people, right? Which you see, there's a different representation between the two churches that you discussed today, right? There's one is very Christ-centric and another is very focused on the masses and the laity, right? And so as we think about space and as we think about art and the art that people forget, how does art and your own process in doing this work shape where you locate the sacred, right? Or how has it shifted or changed or altered or expanded how you map the sacred in terms of spatial terms, social terms, institutional terms, in terms of time? That's something that I thought about today, right? Is Gates' work, is that matter still sacred when it's returned? Do the Mississippi monks sing it back to sanctity, right? So I'm just wondering, what do you think about the sacred? How has your work shifted that?
Yeah, I think, there's definitely, for the Astor, he would say, yes, they are singing it back. And that's where you and I had talked about this, you so wonderfully described the sonic space of transcendence, that music can create in a church. And one of the things that I talk about in this book, I talk about something that I called empathetic realism. And that's what you're relating to in terms of actually seeing people. There are other incidences in the churches where there are portraits of the people who would have been looking at themselves in the murals. There's one, the oldest image is from 1904, and it has an image of a Black Christ and a Black Madonna, and then there are these angels that are young Black children, like leaning on clouds, and that particular self-taught artist said that those were children that he saw in the front pews, leaning. So they would actually be seeing themselves and like the power
As
of
the
that.
image of God, the imago
Yes.
Dei.
Yes, absolutely. And so this empathetic realism that I kept thinking about, and I'm talking about it because I feel like my own growth in this process was also invoking my own empathetic realism with these different congregations. You know, I, again, very naively thought, I'm an art historian, I care about your art, so let me in. And they'd be like, who are you? Like, who the hell are you? Where is your church, girl? And I was like, you know, I'm just coming to look at your art. It's like, well, where do you go? You know? So that kind of process, and I was like, okay, I need to have an answer to where do I go? And so I had to not just come and look at the art on a Monday afternoon, but go to all of these churches on Sunday and on Saturday. And I have to say, I went to St. Sabina a lot. And that was one of the churches that my children still remember as like mom's church, but because they enjoyed it so much. And so being able to understand that I had to not just be an interloper, you know, just because I'm an art historian and I'm interested in your art, that I really had to understand all of the experience that I was then going to be writing about. And that was a real growth aspect for me, and about seeing in all these different places how the sacred is located, processed, created. And again, I still feel like I was somewhat of an outsider being able to go to these different churches and to see that, but that was definitely something that has added to my process as a scholar to slow down, you know? And that this type of work became something that was very different from anything else I had done. And I just want to point out, what became an obsession for me is to have maps in the book. So, and also for the book to be this small. So when I found a publisher, an editor, they were like, wait, you want a small book, but it's an art book. And I was like, but I want people to carry it with them and actually go to these places. And that's why the maps were so important. Still, I think it's very rare for you to read a scholarly art history book, for instance, that has maps about what you're reading, because these are real places with real people in them. And then the maps for me was really fun because they're created thematically. And one thing related to what you talked about with the burned churches, I don't know if you remember, like I have one that there's a map about Black tragedy. And that was the history of lost sites. So that was another thing that made me slow down, was when that church was burned. I had to decide, how do you write about something that's not there anymore when it was so experiential, right? And then I thought, well, people write about things that don't exist all the time. But I took it more into really seeing the context of loss and Black death in Chicago. So a whole nother paper that I had written on in a whole nother context was examining the site where, oh my God, I can't believe I'm forgetting his name, the Black Panther who was killed in Chicago. Yes, I'm sorry. There's like Fred Hampton Way where it is. I totally forgot. There's a condo in that. It's a beautiful condo where that tragic murder of those two men happened. And so I've given, again, it's nothing published, but so I'd given a paper on that, and that made me realize that it had to be in the book, this whole idea of that there are all these sites, you know, where the 1919 riot supposedly started, was that line, that invisible line that was crossed by a young Black swimmer into the white area. These are sites of Black tragedy. That I felt all of these other things that I was looking at were a part of. And so actually, it ended up being an entire chapter in the book. I think I call it, I don't even remember, Where the Black Christ Suffers, I think is what it's called. So I don't know if that answers your question. Okay. Sorry.
So I think, are we at time?
Oh, yes.
Yes, I think Dean Sterling has a close for us.
Use a little Q&A?
Do we have?
Take a question.
Okay, sure.
Take a question.
Okay,
Sorry.
yes.
Absolutely. There's no floating, right? Oh, just kidding.
So feel free to raise your hand, maybe just share your name and your question.
Any questions? No, there aren't any questions. Oh,
I'm curious about for the black churches where there was still white imagery, if you had conversations about this enduring nature of this white imagery, even in black churches, and in particularly the South Side is very black in Chicago. So I'm just curious about that enduring imagery.
you know, I'm trying to think. I really focused on those churches that embraced black imagery. There were some where you could see where they kind of just kept the older imagery, but they still had the black imagery there. And I never talked to them about why do you still have like the Solomon Christ, you know, the traditional Christ there, if you have, you know, gone through the trouble of making an entire mural of black Christ and other biblical figures. There is actually one in here that, I can't remember where it is, that it was tons of Greek Orthodox murals that were in the church itself. St. Edmund's is what it's called. And they kept them all there. But then they put a whole layer again, where the choir is, right behind the pastor, black imagery. And they also had stained glass that had black historical figures. So there was this almost sandwich of black imagery predominantly then that still kept these very large paintings. And I remember I did talk to them about that, and they said, well, they're so big and they're actually so beautiful that we don't want to take them down. And they still are illustrating the stories and the passages that are relevant to what we're talking about. So they really saw it as, well, we know that we can have black imagery, we have it there, but still valuing basically the artistic merit of those. And that was the one explanation I got when I asked, because those were still a large part of the art program.
My name's Noah Adams. I'm a prospective student for the open house tomorrow. But I'm so glad to be able to be here. One of the amazing themes I saw throughout your presentation was just the experience of the people as they came into the churches, into the sacred space there. And then you had to have that own similar experience as you went into those churches. And also when people of different backgrounds and backgrounds are looked down upon are brought into the church and have this unifying experience there. Now, you looked a lot at the art itself, but I wonder about the accounts you must have come in contact with, if you heard about that influence going in the other direction as people go into the church and have this unifying experience, and what impact it had on the community members as they went out back in their homes and other places in the community, if you came across personal experiences of that kind of nature because of these sacred spaces.
Right. Well, again, I have to talk about St. Sabina, since that was the one I spent the most time in. And definitely the amount of being surrounded by that imagery encouraged people to bring that imagery into their homes, right? It really, I hate to say it normalized it, because that sounds so, it's not the right word. But I think it did make an impact. And another church I didn't talk about today is Trinity United Community Church. And that had, I really focused on their church artists. So they had like an artist, they actually created an artist residency that's still going on today. And that particular artist that did all of their imagery, their posters, their flyers, their weekly everything, a newsletter, everything that he made the images. And so I did talk to some of the family members, and they said, yeah, well, his work was everywhere, and they're all Black Christ and Black Madonnas. All of the images that he created were biblical figures that were Black. And so they talked about, and I got to see the archive that they kept of his work because he was so beloved. And just the fact that that ephemera was actually going directly into people's homes. And some of them would frame, like, the images that he made, even though they were just pretty simple line drawings, but very beautiful images that then became religious imagery in their homes. So that's just 2 examples I can think of. Thank you. His name was Joseph Evans, by the way.
Thank you so much. Thanks for being here, Dean Pinder. My name is Sarah. And one of the things I noticed, an observation that I thought was fascinating, even before you get into these inside the churches, is the exterior. And one particular church you mentioned used to be, I think you said, a hat factory. And I grew up in a Haitian American Baptist church in Bridgeport in the inner city, and our building used to be a diner. So I was really interested in that, like, what does that mean, and what was the interaction or the responses from the congregants to be within a church building that is like another world on the inside, but on the outside, I was trying to figure out, like, is that a school, or what is that, and having that similar experience of being in a church that used to be a diner.
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, it was, you can actually Google this church. Because Cobb's was such a charismatic figure and so well known because of his radio broadcasts, there's a lot of contemporary articles, interviews, Ebony Magazine featured him a lot, and of course, the Chicago Defender. So that's where I got a number of these testimonies, or whatever you would call them, of people talking about how they used to work in the factory, and then became actually part of the people who went there to hear him speak. So that's pretty much all I knew about that, but it did make an impact. I mean, because he took something that basically was what their labor was and transformed it into a sacred space, right? The other really important aspect of his egalitarian way in which he addressed the fact that he was often speaking to laborers, and he actually has in some of his sermons that are in my book, something that was on the header of his weekly newsletter was about all laborers come unto me. And so he required that people wear white when they came, and that was so to, again, make everyone equal. That he was directly addressing how people sometimes did not go to other middle class or upper class churches because they had to dress well. And he thought everyone can have something that's white. And if you don't, you could bleach it, right? And so that was his common denominator, a way of making everyone feel like they can still come to his church. So those are, I think, some of the things that relate to the fact that that space was so associated with labor. And he acknowledged that.
I think that's all we have time for, and we're going to have a reception, though, if I'm not mistaken. Dean Sterling.
So would you join me first in thanking our panelists?